Hello and good afternoon, everyone. I'm here to have a great conversation with Dan Smith, who is a poet and former farmer and who lives in the Driftless area. I'm not exactly sure where. When I read that article, Dan, so you're east and south of Arena, is that right?
Yeah, we're about 15 minutes from Arcadia Bookstore, which is a great place to be because we can be there very quickly. So
okay. Never hurts to have a plug right at the top. But we're here to discuss Dan's wonderful book of poems called Ancestral, which I'm holding up badly as I speak. So Dan, before we get into the poems themselves and lots of specific questions, can you just sort of share with us the genesis of the book and frankly the genesis of your writing life? I don't know what your major was in college. And speaking of college, I read that you're one of 8 children, all of whom got college degrees while your parents were running a farm. I call that some kind of small miracle, and incredibly impressive. And all of your sons went to college and graduated and now have, one might say, honest jobs. Yes. So that's so anyway, just could you just give us a little background on the book, on your writing life, who influenced you, etc., things like that.
Sure. I started writing very early in life to capture the experience that I think I was aware of being quite unique at an early age, which was the life of a family dairy farm in the Midwest. A family dairy farm that really was our whole world. The 320 acres where everything, the work and the home and the business was all tied together. And I think I realized fairly early on that that was unique and that it was something that may not be permanent. And I wanted to capture parts of the farming life very similar to the way a photographer captures a scene. And my poems always did that to me. If my dad would say something that I thought was very significant or something, I would try to weave that into a poem. So the collection of Ancestral really stretches over 40 years. The oldest poem was written when I was in high school. The newest poem is only a couple months old. Over the whole course of those years, my poetry changed as my life changed. So there's a significant part of the book that I refer to kind of as the farm poems, the poems that really came from doing the work of a farmer, living that life, raising, Cheryl and I raising our 3 sons on the farm. There are poems that I call kind of character farm poems because you come across some really interesting people in farming, poems like Plowman or poems like Texas 1974, or some of the poets that I was able to meet over the course of my life, such as Gary Snyder or Lucian Strike or Forrest Gander, while I was farming, and kind of weave their influence on me into the poetry. And then in 2007, we sold our dairy herd when it was just Cheryl and I on the farm at that time. And in 2008, with the intention when we sold our dairy farm to continue to live there. But one thing that I found out, James, is that on a dairy farm, when the cows leave, the soul of the farm really leaves. Wow. I was not happy as a farmer without the cows. I was a dairyman more than I was a farmer. When you're milking, the milk hauler comes every day, the veterinarian comes several times a week, the feed truck. When the cows leave, none of those people can come. And Cheryl and I found it a very isolated world and work that I really wasn't interested that much in doing anymore. So we decided, since we both had graduated from the University of Wisconsin, and when we were in Madison, way back in the 70s, we loved the Driftless area. We loved Spring Green in that area. And, all the years that it was preposterous at the time, we thought, if we ever leave the farm, we know where we're going to go. we're going to go west of Madison so we can be near Madison. And all three of our sons graduated from the University of Wisconsin. So we were strongly connected to this place. It was a second home. So in 2008, we found a 22-acre farm where life would be much easier. The farm would be for, would not be our business, but it would be for our enjoyment. And we purchased that farm, and we did something that, I think at one time we probably could not believe we were doing, and that was to leave a family farm that had been in the generation for in the family for 3 generations. And there's a lot in the book about that transition, James, about the pain of having to give something up in order to move on in your life. And then I was able to use all this experience that I've just talked about into my first job off the farm was as a crisis counselor for the Department of Agriculture, where I traveled around the state and met with farmers and their families, talking to farmers who had financial problems or family conflicts or health problems, who needed a succession plan for the next generation, whatever their issue was. But most of those were financial crisis calls. And because of having lived this life that I just described, I had credibility. I wasn't just a state employee showing up. I had walked the walk. And that some of those poems in their voices are in this collection as well.
Yeah, and those are really very, very potent, powerful poems. And let's get to those in a little while. But since you brought up the idea of this transition, is there a particular poem that you think kind of embodies the transition to your present life? I mean, I don't want you don't need to read this particular poem right now, but the poem Dry Dirt seems to me to be not just your story, but many farmers' stories.
Yes.
And I wasn't sure whether that was personal to you or whether that was another voice you were carrying. But it's a really, that one is really potent. But I'm sure you have is there a poem or two that you think you could start with? And then I also want you, because you brought it up, the Texas 1974. I think you should read that.
Okay.
Just as a way of letting us in on what I assume is you.
Yes.
Trying to travel out of the milieu that you knew to see what the rest of the world might be like, and that the way the poem ends is just so perfect in the way that it's somebody telling you something surprising. I would think sort of turns your thinking back into yourself, which I thought was just brilliant. But before you read that, if you have a particular poem about about your transition that you think embodies it best, why don't you read that for us?
Sure. I think I'll read the first poem that I wrote when we moved here, and it was actually written while we were moving in. So when you move off a farm that's been in the family for 3 generations, there's a lot of physical stuff that has to be dealt with. And it took me over a year to go through the buildings and 2 houses that were on the farm and sort everything out. And I brought a lot of stuff with me that I simply could not leave behind. And I still have a lot of that stuff. And the poem that I'm going to read is called Anvil. Anvil. I've hauled my father's anvil due north, up out of the black Illinois farm ground he and I together worked. Decades our home. Set down 60 pounds onto the floor of this old barn, new only to me. All around our bewildered tools hang in the strange light of the cracked window pane, where I stand looking out over land not yet home. It is growing late on a late winter's day. At my feet, my father's anvil, his striking song of steel on steel, still hammering home.
It's beautiful. I just love that, looking out over land not yet home. And that it just takes time for land to become home. And then that song, I love also the image of the song of the steel on steel, which of course also brings to mind trains and all sorts of other images of steel on steel, and that you could look at that anvil and always hear it.
Yes.
At work, that's really potent. It's great. Well, why don't you jump ahead and do the Texas 1974, just as a kind of change of pace.
Well, I got the bright idea one summer in college. I spent 2 summers in college not going home to work on the farm, but to work out, which my dad and mother always encouraged us to do. Go do something on your own. Don't feel like you have to come home to work here all the time. One of those summers, I went on the wheat harvest out west and drove combine on a crew. We started in Texas, in northern Texas, in the middle of May, and we ended up in North Dakota in August. And the day that I left the crew to head back to Madison was a significant day, because as I was packing up to leave the motel room and head home to Madison to go back to school, Richard Nixon was on the television resigning. Wow. So I always remember what day that was.
Yeah, absolutely.
But we started off in Texas, and this was one of the first week of something happened, and I put it into the poem called Texas 1974. Halfway through the first good week of harvest, North Texas dry land wheat, the combine snapped a shaft. With a kick and a cuss, the boss left for parts, 80 miles round trip. Old Texan Harry Martin, wheat rancher, cattleman, oil driller, offered a hand. So he and I started in, tearing the big gleaner down, backing off belts, loosening chains, pulling bearings. The tools hot in our hands, on our backs in the cheat grass, shirts soaked, fire ants at our ankles, grasshoppers leaping in the heat. Till an hour later, we took a break, and there in the shade of the heavy traction wheels, he wanted to know, what's a college boy like you doing cutting wheat? I told him I'd never been this far west, wanted to see the country. Harry Martin, his body brown and bent as old mesquite, stared with eyes calm as summer fallow over miles of endless wheat, spit between his boots and said, you know, kid, I really don't think you would have missed a goddamn thing.
I love that ending, because it's the last thing you think he's going to say.
By the end of that summer, James, I knew what Harry Martin was trying to tell me. There was a lot of wheat and there wasn't much else.
Yeah. And I think that's so great that someone just has he just knows, and he's just, okay. Let me give you a reality sandwich here. There's nothing out here.
It was like, I know you're 19, but here's how it really is.
Yeah, you want romance? Get into a road show of Oklahoma. God, but it's so great, but it does tie in, to a sort of a theme that kind of links through a few of the poems, and also in in that article in the paper last weekend when you were interviewed, where you make the comment that you'd been just working this farm, and that you hadn't traveled, that you hadn't gone anywhere, and that you were heading to be 60 or 60 plus, no, almost 60, and you're just, and at a certain point, but that's a big for someone who's done the same thing for 30 years. And the last, how many years of it did you do it by yourself? Just, basically
years.
Yeah, that's a huge amount of work, but it's so easy to just let the wheels keep turning, and life just keeps going on, and all of a sudden, there's the shock of saying, well, now we'd like to travel, but we can't because we're too old or whatever.
Right.
Or when I fell and broke my shoulder, now I can't travel, whatever. So tell me about a little bit about that kind of, because it's in the, it just sneaks into the poems every now and then, which I love. You never, if you never, if you'll pardon the pun, you never hit us over the head with an anvil, but you really, you sneak this longing for something else quietly in there.
Mm-hmm.
There are those who travel and those who shelter in place, in the hummingbird poem, and there are 4 or 5 other places that I picked out. But it's just, so tell me about how that, his kind of a comment and the choice you made nobody else, none of your other brothers and sisters were interested in carrying on the farming?
I farmed with one of my brothers for a while, but he left about 10 years before I did. But the other 6 all found honest work, as you said before. So one of the things that I've understood when I was on the farm was that farming can kind of trap you on a treadmill. And I think of all the types of farming, dairy farming does that the strongest. And it's because every 12 hours you have to report to the barn to milk. And I remember saying to my dad when I told him I wanted to come back to the farm after college and farm, and he said, why? And I said, well, I want to be my own boss. And he said, on a dairy farm, the cows are the boss. They will tell you when you are working and when you might not be, but most of the time you're going to be working. And it's going to be every 12 hours. And you get into a rhythm. And I remember when Gary Snyder, the poet, stayed with me for a couple of days when he came to Freeport to give a reading. And Gary Snyder was one of the biggest influences in my life, not just in my poetry, I mean, in my life. And one of the things that he said to me was, you could have just been a monk because you're answering a bell very similar to a monk does. And you're going through a practice, the milking, that reminds me of a meditative practice. And only Gary Snyder would have that type of a vantage point or of understanding of it.
Right.
But what he had captured in that, I saw in myself and I saw in so many farmers as I worked with them around the state. And one of the things that I always tried to get farmers to do when they needed an exit plan. So the farm was out of equity or the bank said, you're done or anything like that. And they were struggling to figure out what they could do next. I would say the first thing you have to do is sell the cows. And they would say, oh, that's crazy because that's the income. And I said, that is the income, but it's also the expense. And you cannot plan the rest of your life if every 12 hours you're in the dairy barn milking those cows. It will just become the next 12 hours. And I've seen farmers go through this for years, knowing they had to get out, but they can't get out because it's always the next milking is coming. When I sold the cows, it was a total shock to our routine. I had so much time on my hands. The income stopped, but the expenses stopped, the work, the repetitive showing up in the barn every 12 hours. And for the first time, I could lift my head up, James, and see a future. Now I could say, okay, that's done. Now what are we going to do? And until you do that, you can't look forward. You're just, my dad used to call it barn blindness, which I love that term.
That's a great term.
That after a while, you've been in the barn so much that you can't see your life, see your kids, see the bigger world. All you see is the barn. You become blind to anything but the barn.
Well, yeah, and I love that there's a startling section in your poem, In the Fall of My Life, where the farmer talks about his life being so selfish.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And that's really a startling phrase because you just feel like the last thing a farmer is selfish.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But but you could, but as soon as he said it, and then I sort of moved back in the poem and moved forward in the poem. I thought, yeah, I mean, it is a selfish choice,
Right. Yeah.
because it isolates you from all other choices,
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
it isolates you from other parts of your family. Wow. Why don't you read the Gary Snyder poem? Because that's such a sweet poem. And he was, I mean, he was a huge influence on many people's lives, obviously, and should have been. And I shouldn't say in the past tense, he's still with us, but it's a remarkable man and a remarkable poet and a Buddhist and many other wonderful things. But yeah, read that. I think that's a great way to.
So maybe I'll preface it by when I was a sophomore at the University of Wisconsin, I was in a used bookstore on State Street. I remember it like it was yesterday. Well, it must have been 1973, 74, something like that. And I found a used copy of Gary Snyder's book, The Backcountry.
Ah.
And I took that book home, and you talk about the power of poetry. That changed me not only in how I wanted to see how I saw the world, but I wanted to write some way that would make even one person feel the way I felt when I read that book.
Yeah.
That it would change my view of the world that way. And so I studied Snyder's work so much over the years, read about him through his association with Jack Kerouac and others. And then in the late 1990s, I was on a group with a community college in Freeport, and they had an endowment to bring in a poet to read, and we decided to bring in Gary. So I got somebody assigned the job to me, which I readily accepted, of hosting him. So Gary spent some time at the farm with me, and Gary had grown up on a small dairy farm in Washington State, and had been outside all his life as a logger, he's been so many things I couldn't even mention them. And then when he was leaving that day to head back to California, he said these exact words to me, and I knew that he was giving me a gift. I knew he was doing it intentionally. And the poem is called What Gary Snyder Said to Me That Day in the Doorway of the Milking Barn. I am going to tell you what you need to do. You need to teach these cows to meditate, to lose their bodies in a trance for, say, 5 days. Then they will need no feed. They will give no milk. And you can leave and come out to see me, and I can show you my trees.
It's just such a brilliant solution.
It was a couple years after that poem appeared in a literary journal, and somebody saw it who was friends with Gary and sent it to Gary, and Gary wrote to me, and he said, I remember saying that, and you captured it perfectly, and I'm glad you caught it. Yeah. And I knew he was doing it intentionally.
Yeah, that's that kind of sneaky teaching that's really, really masterful. Yeah. And so speaking of that, would you read The Woods for me? It's on page 6 of your book.
Thank you.
Just in case you haven't memorized where poems are. And then I want to follow that because you gave that nice clue. I want to follow that with craftsmanship.
Okay.
Because it's 2 poems, I think, that directly relate to what Gary Snyder was doing, which is you're doing to your sons in a way. Of kind of, in the first of the 2 poems, I love the fact that you don't tell them something. So let's read that first, The Woods.
So one of the things, going back to that every 12 hours you have to milk, when you do have time on the farm, you don't run off to the amusement park or go very far away, because it's a very short window of time. And what Cheryl and I always tried to do, one, we spent a lot of time reading when we had the chance, and 2, our entertainment was the farm. We stayed on the farm. We did a lot of hiking. We spent a lot of time with the boys when they were young, just experiencing the farm. And this really captures one of those moments. It's called The Woods. Sunday morning, The path winds beneath bare branches of aspen, oak, elm, and linden. My sons follow, trusting I'll bend back brambles, cast blocking limbs aside. Wide-eyed, silent, they see these 5 acres of woods on Grandpa's farm as wilderness. I want to tell them, value nothing more than you value these woods. Its floor of acorns and leaves, its sky of arched trees. But instead, only promise to walk often in sacred procession, visitors, explorers, seekers in this holy land of rabbit, squirrel, deer, and fox.
Yeah, it's so great. It just because it's really good parenting,
Thank you.
which is to say, don't tell them that it's a great place. Just let them figure out that it's a great place. The repetition of just being in it,
Mm-hmm.
keeping their eyes open, and you let us know that they are wide-eyed, so they're letting it in. It's coming in.
Yeah.
And you're doing the 2 most important things, which is they're not going to get brambles and they're not going to fall over a limb and go, this sucks. I don't want to go on this.
Yeah, exactly.
You hear a 6-year-old going, come on, I fell down and hurt myself. I don't want to go home. And I just think it's just really great. Only promise to walk often in sacred procession. And that's all you need to do.
Mm-hmm.
Just promise and then trust that they're wide-eyed enough. They'll get it.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, I hate to point out to you, Dan, none of them are on the farm now, but
That's right.
okay, would you mind then just to connect that to craftsmanship?
Yeah,
30 and 31.
Segue to that. So Cheryl and I had 3 sons, and as I said, they all graduated from UW, and then they went on. And I was thinking one day about their career choices. So Austin is a poet and a writer and a lecturer at Stanford, a very well-known, internationally known writer who's been very, very successful in his career. Ryan is a facial plastic surgeon and reconstruction surgeon in a Rush Hospital in Chicago. And Levi is a mergers and acquisitions attorney in Minneapolis. So 3 very different things. But I was thinking about how the farm prepared them for the work that they did, and how, as stressful as their jobs are now, how it is very similar to what we did all those years on the farm, and how some of our experience from there may have led them and helped them deal with that stress today. And this is called craftsmanship for my sons. These are just chores. I've told you that time and again. It is what we do when we rise in the morning and head out, ready and able to take on whatever the day puts before us. Equipped with all you have studied, crafted, absorbed, and perfected through the dedicated hours that led you down the long path of practice. So that now you hold in your hands, hearts, and minds the defined tools of your craftsmanship, able to diagnose the emerging illness, elusive solution, or perfected phrase. Afoot on your daily rounds, mind and body determined to assist the student, client, or patient. No difference from all those chores we tackled side by side together as we tended the sickly calf, or the withering crop, or the rusted chain we feared might break.
Yeah, it's a beautiful poem, and it has such a sort of sneaky, potent last 2 lines, or the rusted chain we feared might break, which is, also obviously the chain of family and the chain of that sort of important connection. Yes. So you're kind of reiterating to them through the poem how what you did to provide them the tools they took the tools and became craftsmen of different things, but they also learned the potency of family and of not letting the chain break.
Mhm.
And it's just a really beautiful poem. Thanks. Now, I said before we started, to let you know, that there's a triptych of little poems that all connect to kind of farmers struggling
Mhm.
with, but I think, which the poems that I was thinking of were Dry Dirt, Next Year, and Crisis Call.
Okay.
But I'd love for you to read that sly little poem on page 32, Note to the Hired Hand, which is, about farm work in a very unusual way. I just, it really, to me, it's the same. It's like reading William Carlos Williams,
Yeah.
wheelbarrow poem.
Yeah. Yes.
Or
the Left Behind Note poem. Yeah.
yeah,
Mhm.
right. The peaches in the ice box, that are no longer there. But but if you could start with that, and then let's go on to those other three, and then I want to follow that if you'll put up with me, with three poems that really, to me, are about kind of what you've discovered, in your later life. But let's do those four, and you can introduce them or say
Okay.
nothing or tell me to go shut up, whatever.
Okay. So Note to the Hired Hand.
Yeah.
Okay. Note to the hired hand. The gate you left open, the pony found. I spotted her at dawn, knee deep in alfalfa. Drunk on feed and freedom, she fled, I chased 1/2 hour through morning rain. You'll find her now, back in the barn, waiting to be brushed.
I just love that. And the great line, of course, that makes everything worse is 1/2 hour through morning rain. It wasn't bad enough that I had to chase the damn horse. It was raining. And
I could have worn out. So
I could have brushed the horse, but guess who's going to brush the horse, pal? Oh my gosh, it's so good. I laughed out loud. It's the sort of thing my father would have done to me, and probably so. Except we didn't have a farm, thank God, or I wouldn't be here. Okay. But if you want to, if those three poems make sense to you to read together, then please share them, and then we'll go on.
Okay, I'll start with Dry Dirt.
Okay.
This poem really came from, I remember the day I wrote this poem, and I remember how I was feeling. And you don't just leave the third generation of a farm or 30 years of farming at the drop of a hat. It was a process over the years as the boys got older, as Cheryl and I got older, as farming changed, as the farm demanded more and more investment and work just to keep up, that you have to start looking, it slowly dawns on you that you can feel the change coming. And if you can accept that and absorb it, that maybe you'll get through this. Maybe you'll emerge into a happy, productive life later on and not let the farm trap you. And I remember this day, it was towards the end of my farming career, it was a very dry spell in the summer. And I wrote Dry Dirt. Just today, I felt myself fall out of love with this land. Turned my back on cornfields rolled up tight as pineapple. All afternoon, listened to the wind rattle the pasture gate. I watched dust devils dance across the bottom ground. How many times can a man kick dirt? Swear it has never been so dry. Now I drop decades of tending crops and cattle into a heap out back. Pull the year shut like one would an old door on an empty barn. as a poem that basically is that turning point where you start thinking, I can't do this anymore.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's really great, and again, I just admire how you just keep a wonderful control over the line, control over the the phrasing, so that it never feels like, oh, poor me. It's just the discoveries. You're just making the discoveries, and then you have the poetic image of pulling the ear shut like one would, and then again it ties it back to the empty barn. And there are moments, it's like Stanley Kunitz's great poem, "The End of Summer," where you just have these flashes and you think, okay, this part of my life is over.
Yes.
And it has to be over.
It has to be over. And it was still valuable and a beautiful life, but you can love more than one place. You can love more than one way of living in your life. And if you can make that transition, you have a chance to take the best from it and move on.
Yeah,
or else swallow you up.
Right. Yeah. It isn't negating what you've done.
Yeah, right.
What you've done, and again, using it to the next thing. Right. Okay. Then the other two are more specifically related, I think, to the work you've been doing, or you did do with the other farmers. But it's this Next Year and Crisis Call, and you can read them either.
Okay. I always chuckle when I read Next Year, because I read this one time years ago in the 90s, because this was written when I was farming. And I read it at a reading, and there was sometimes in Freeport, actually, when I would give readings, other farmers would come. And I don't think they'd ever been at a poetry reading before. And I read that poem, and one farmer stood up and he said, well, that isn't poetry, that's Ag Econ 101. And I think he's right. I always think of that when I read this poem.
That's great.
Next Year, knowing nothing else, he signs the dotted line, securing another loan with a second mortgage on land he'll never own. Calls co-op, orders fertilizer, fuel, and seed. Welds his broken up equipment back into one piece. Stays out all night in the black fields, putting in a crop. Worries and waits for the rain, which comes too late. Watches June, July, and August, a week stand, battle the dry weeds. Till harvest hauls in half a crop, which pays 1/3 the bills. He figures the loss at $100 per acre. Pushes a pencil all the winter nights, calculating how many more acres he'll need to make some real money next year.
Yeah. Boy, that's a real punch.
Yeah.
Okay, let's do the other poem, and then we'll read three sweeter, calmer poems so that people don't think, oh my God.
So for several years after leaving the farm, as I said, I worked as a crisis counselor at the Department of Agriculture. It's been that service has been in place since 1984. Has helped thousands and thousands of farmers with every type of problem. And unfortunately, a couple times a year, you get a call where somebody's really threatening to do something severe to themselves. And this call came in one time, and sometimes they're tough. They're tough to listen to. They're tough. Do you jump in the car and try to get out there? Do you call a sheriff? What do you do? And this was one of those calls that we had to try to work through. Crisis call. Just once, I'd like to be one of the haves instead of the have-nots. Get a boost up instead of a kick in the teeth. So tired of this cold rain falling. By July, it will all be dry weeds. I don't know my own kids anymore. I can't imagine lives beyond the hill. The wife long ago forgot how to wife. When did she get this bitter and mean? I have a 12 gauge loaded, think I'll take a walk down through the woods. Take a walk down through the woods.
Right.
All you can do in those situations is try to keep them talking and hope that they'll set up a meeting with you where you can talk to them.
Right.
But it's not wiffle ball. It's tough slide when you have to do that.
Important work. God. Okay, so let's get on to three, let's just say, lighter toned poems. And then probably I'm going to have you read one more thing in talking about some of the long poems. And then we should probably, because we're moving up towards an hour here. But the three poems I thought, again, kind of linked together in a beautiful way are the poems Evening on Night Hollow, Searching, and To Pause.
Okay.
Okay. Do those make sense to you together?
Very much. Yeah. And thank you for that, because evening, we live on Night Hollow Road now. I spent most of my life on the same farm. This is the only other place I've lived since I graduated from college. And we love our home here, and it's been wonderful, and it's given us everything we wanted. And I just wanted a poem that kind of captured how now we feel at home, surrounded by this environment, surrounded by this house. Evening on Night Hollow. At dusk, deer slip from the woods, quiet as yarn through a needle. They press pointed hooves into the soft soil beneath the soybeans. Far down valley, a cow calls her calf to come back. Soon stars will appear and stare down on us all. This is how it is, how it has always been on farms where I have lived. If I smoked, I would light a cigarette on a dark, open porch. Let it cut the darkness so all would know I am here and watching. I was trying to capture the fact that we're here. We've made this transition. We love what I'm watching. And it's important that Cheryl and I have set down roots here and have a new life here.
Yeah, that's great. It's almost like a sweet-natured Edward Hopper painting. I mean, you could just see the light of the cigarette bathing the writer's face in a sort of orange glow, and a deer watching from the woods. It's just, it's really beautiful. Okay, and then the other two, one we put in the newsletter this morning because I love it so much, and then which is To Pause, and then Searching is the other.
I had the privilege to know the poet Lucian Strike, who was an incredible person, poet, translator, teacher. I could go on. And I was thinking of his influence on my life and how long it took me to understand lots of what he tried to tell me for years. And sometimes things kind of catch up to you later on as you get older in life, and maybe you're now in the position where you can understand what he was trying to tell you years ago. And especially with this poem, one of the things that I have now, James, that I never had as a farmer is the gift of time. I was always rushing off to work. I was always in the barn, and I give so much credit to Cheryl for the hours and hours that she did things on her own, or raising the kids, or just running the house, because I was always in the barn. And I was thinking about that, and I wrote To Pause for Lucian Strike. At last, I have learned to pause east of the barn, near the old stone wall of a silo long fallen. Beneath the swallows taking flight through the open doorway, the garden cooling, the June evening turning inward, my breath calm as the fading light, my thoughts not going to any other place or time, no forgotten or unspoken language, no discarded task or lingering remorse, only this night filling with stars that just now I have found the wisdom to accept. Better late than never, James.
Yeah, that's right. Absolutely. I know. I was running a theater, and I thought, when are you going to have that bookstore?
Yes, yeah.
I mean, that's And when I was having that thought, maybe 3 months later, somebody called me up from Spring Green and said, "Hey, did you know the flower shop's for sale?" So that's how life works sometimes. Okay, read Searching for me, would you? And then we'll do one more thing, and then we'll call it a day.
I mentioned before, that 320-acre farm had been my life since I learned to walk. And I knew everything on that farm. I knew every square inch of it. I knew where everything was. And then when I got to Madison and started working for the Department of Agriculture, I was always lost. I got so frustrated trying to find my car, or trying to find a legislator's office in the Capitol, or just, having an appointment downtown that I was supposed to meet somebody. I'd be wandering around trying to find it. And I decided that I was always searching, and I really wish that someday I could get back to being as comfortable in this world as I was in my previous world. Searching. Each day demands to be reckoned with. These crossroads, walkways of a new city, of a new life, strange as stepping out onto a new planet. My cautious footfall striking the unfamiliar pavement, searching hallways, alleyways, whole unmapped neighborhoods, to gather what was scattered, to own again what was lost. Like once, as a child, I searched the deep woods for a wayward newborn calf, feeling all the while the darkness descending, the time running short.
Yeah. Yeah, that awareness of time is so potent, and it's brave. What you did was brave to start a new life, and it's when it's the right thing, that's what feeds you and keeps you moving forward. And I think that's really. Okay. So I just wanted to point out to people who haven't seen the book or have not read it yet, that Dan there are 3 or 4 long poems that are connected to the voices of these other farmers. They probably compose. Don't you think it's about a quarter of the book are those 4 long poems? I think.
Yeah, probably. Yeah.
But the poems are: "Our fields are so wet, a gathering of waters, in the fall of my life, and the fields in winter." And it's they're both, all 4 of them have sections that are really potent and sobering, and some are joyful, but they're all these voices of people in crisis. And I should say, because I'm moved by what you've done, I mean, the fact that you did that, and the fact that you were someone that they could trust, because you weren't somebody who'd never been be a farmer.
Right.
That, the kind of ways that you've helped people is really a great thing, and you should be proud of that. And I'm proud of you for doing it. It's great. But I'd love for you to read either the last section or the last 2 sections of A Gathering of Waters, and then we'll let that be the end point for our discussion. And I thank you so much for taking the time to do this. And I will do an official goodbye after you finish reading it, but it's, you can go ahead and introduce it.
Okay. And thank you, James. Thank you for having Arcadia Bookstore there, because it is Cheryl and my second home. And we love it, and we love all of you there. And thank you for all the support you've given me in Austin over the years. A Gathering of Waters is about the terrible floods of 1993 that inundated the Midwest. And a member of my family was affected by that flood, lost his home down along the Missouri River. NPR, National Public Radio, that summer did an amazing job of capturing the actual stories of people. And I went back and listened to their audio archives. And the voices of people and their stories or the images they presented came together in a long poem. It's disjointed, it's in different sections, different voices, different experiences. But I tried to capture how many people were impacted by that summer's rain. And I'll just read the concluding section here that kind of sums up the end after the flood has moved on. Moonlight over water, moonlight over land. I go out walking late in the night on the levee that separates and protects. It was the river geese that called me out. I heard them passing overhead, leaving the Northland, heading south, following the river south, leaving the Northland behind. So much water flowing down from the uplands, heading south. Years past high water, some lives restored with homes, entire towns reset on solid ground. This night, walking levees out on my own, where land holds to water and water to land, I find the stain of past floods pressed into the bluffs and tall trees. A remembrance set hard and fast above the black, sleeping water.
Yeah, it's kind of the perfect way to end a poem that has so much devastation about water, and you're out there in the beauty of the night and the water is quiet, but it's that last line that's the haunting one, of the black sleeping water. It's just sleeping. It'll come get you again. Mm-hmm. It's just really, it's so good. Thank you again, Dan. The book is Ancestral. I think we have a copy or two left, but they're going fast, and I don't mean that in a jocular way. It's coming out of the store quickly, which is great. It should. And Dan, you're a wonderful man and a refined poet, and it's been great spending the afternoon with you.
Thank you. I've enjoyed it so much.
Okay, thanks.